Well, since the mid-2000s, Oklahoma lawmakers have cut state income taxes by more than $1 billion. Certainly a savings for taxpayers, but a real problem for state services. And we're not alone. Just to our north, the state of Kansas enacted similar income tax cuts and totally eliminated the personal income tax for certain business owners. But rather than implementing the cuts over the course of a decade like in Oklahoma, in Kansas, the cuts were implemented in just 2 years. It's been called the Kansas experiment, and by their governor's own description, it's a real-life experiment in supply-side economics.
No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income. Today,
since the days of Ronald Reagan, a favorite conservative principle is that by lowering taxes, you spur investment and create more wealth to offset the lost revenue from those tax collections. So when one-time presidential candidate Sam Brownback was elected Kansas governor in 2010,
wow, what a wave! This has really been a clean sweep for a new beginning.
He turned that political philosophy into economic reality by dramatically cutting income tax rates and exempting business income from any income tax liability, saying this would be a shot of adrenaline into the Kansas economy.
Our income tax revenue dropped like a rock.
Dwayne Gosen is the former budget director for the state of Kansas.
Our state revenues were far below the expenses that we needed to pay,
creating a structural deficit that even led to the downgrading of Kansas's credit rating.
Governor, do you have a message for Standard & Poor and some of these other ratings organizations that are whacking the state?
This is what I've said. It's hard to break the addiction to high taxes. It's hard to do, but we need to do it to create growth.
But much of that projected growth never materialized. So Kansas started making cuts to schools, roads, and health care just to make ends meet. But even that wasn't enough.
Even after lowering expenses, they were facing just a huge gap. And finally, at the end of the longest and probably bitterest legislative session in Kansas history, even the most conservative lawmakers voted to raise sales taxes and cigarette taxes and a few other things.
None of this was easy, but it was the right thing to do.
So in 2015, Kansas began to raise taxes, increasing the state's sales tax to its highest rate ever.
And it's not unlike when Reagan did his major tax cut at the first of his administration. The next year, they raised taxes. They said, well, we've got a budget we've got to deal with, and they did. So you had that calibration that you worked with, and I think this is a very similar move to what happened at that point in time.
And probably few know the inside story of the Kansas experiment better than Stephen J. Anderson.
Actually, Sam and I didn't know each other from Adam. He had read some of the things I had written about fiscal conservatism, called me out of the blue to interview with him when I went up. We had some common goals.
So Anderson became Governor Brownback's budget director during the pinnacle of the tax cuts.
You know, from the minute a plan is instituted to the time that it begins, things change. It was not the governor's tax plan, because what we had was a march to zero that was a gradual descent. When the Senate passed out what they thought was a tax plan that the House would never pass, they made a bad error. You know, one of those events occurs that is a once in a lifetime where all of a sudden you zero a tax out overnight.
And quickly went awry because the tax cuts were not paired with structural changes to government.
It's tough. Government is not like the private sector. Government has a hard time adjusting. There are issues that go on within the internal structure of government that are poorly understood. For example, over a third of any budget in any state is controlled by the federal government. The option does not exist to cut there. It's what we call maintenance of effort.
A problem Oklahoma state lawmakers are having to deal with this session. Oklahoma ranks 17th in the nation in the amount of federal aid we receive, accounting for more than a third of the state's general revenue.
Those structures make it very difficult to change, and I think that's part of what Kansas has ran into.
And Oklahoma may be headed for. Currently, Oklahoma offers tax credits to an array of state businesses. Figure in all the state dollars tied to federal funding, and what is left to spend this legislative session could be less than a fourth of all total state revenue. And of that, 94% is appropriated to the state's 12 largest agencies. A disastrous dilemma for state services any way you slice it. Something our neighbors to the north know all too well.
They essentially shifted our tax burden from income to sales, or pushed it that direction.
Which are widely regarded as more regressive.
In terms of the regressivity of the Kansas March to Zero, or the experiment, we've raised sales tax twice this most recent time, and the net impact is that the poorest 40% of Kansans actually saw their overall net tax burden go up.
Annie McKay is the executive director of the Kansas Center for Economic Growth and says while sales tax hit those that make the least the most, middle-class Kansas families have also seen local property taxes rise to offset the cuts in state dollars.
I think unless Oklahoma recognizes that the income tax cuts are not the way to grow the economy, that Kansas is absolutely what Oklahoma is looking to in terms of the future, what they will have. You know, what Oklahoma seeks to accomplish over 15 years, Kansas condensed down to a 3 or 4 year period. And so we're on the same march, we've just been sprinting through it, whereas Oklahoma has taken a more leisurely walk. But the revenue loss is the same.